stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now.
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1413th edition of Motorsports Unlimited. Today, we're getting back to my explanation of why Motorsports Unlimited was created and what I was trying to accomplish some 30 years ago when it began. As previously mentioned, early in my life, I was concerned about the demise and indeed the survival of motorsports. And through observation and analysis, I was convinced television was the culprit. Oh, I'm not talking about the box with the screen on it that we've been all staring at most of our lives. That's an inanimate object. I'm talking about the messages coming from that box, the audio and video messages that inundate our society and influence every detail of our lives. I questioned, who gets to use this communications medium, and for what purpose? The medium was clearly so powerful that even being omitted had disastrous consequences, and certainly motorsport was omitted. The question was, why? And what can be done about it? During my struggle to resolve these issues, a new kind of television was created, cable television. And lo and behold, cable television had a legal requirement to provide public access. Apparently, I wasn't the only one concerned about the power network television had over our society, and this was an effort to give everyone voice. I explained all this in the past few explanation episodes. Oh, this one is explanation 7. And when we left off, I was talking about the incredible difficulties I encountered trying to participate. And at the same time, I took a moment to remind the audience that what I experienced happened 30 years ago, and things have changed significantly since then, and public access cable has matured into a viable local option. I talked a little bit about what I called the great cable wars of the early days because they were important and significantly added to my burden of raising public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. While it was indeed warfare and consumed a lot of my time, there were some bright spots, as is often the case. For example, I found myself so angry with the cable companies, I sought help from the local governments, which I felt were responsible for watching these guys. I remember one in particular that ended up giving me confidence to this day in what proper government can do. Let me tell you the story. And it turned out to be quite a story. I'd been fighting with Continental Cablevision by myself for more than a year and getting sick and tired of it. Still, I don't mind a good scrap, and while I'd rather do things with please and thank yous, if a brawl is called for, then a brawl it will be. There are things, however, that are out of bounds in my mind, and the evening the Westmont Continental Cablevision employees insulted my guest was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. I was interviewing an elderly man who had come quite a distance to participate in the show. As usual, because of the distance I had to travel to participate in public access television, I've been through all this before and I don't want to rehash it again. It'll all be in the book anyway. The point is, I was trying to make it work, and Continental, in my mind, was trying to make it not work. I got started on the interview late because of the late crew, the lack of crew, again because of the same problem, the distance involved. Anyway, I was about halfway through the interview when the Continental employee came into the studio, walked onto the set, and removed my guest's mic and informed me that my time was up. The elderly man that I was interviewing was as bewildered as I was furious. I mean, the entire reason I was running late was because I was bending over backwards trying to make this stupid arrangement of traveling over an hour to participate work. In my mind, I was doing them a favor, and they were acting like I exceeded what I had a right to expect. In any event, we closed up shop for the evening. I fell all over myself apologizing to my guest and, in my own mind, resolved that this would never happen again. The next day, I marched myself into the Franklin Park Village Hall and asked who the hell was supposed to be watching these people. Of course, the clerk had no idea what I was talking about, but after determining it had something to do with cable, remember, this was 30 years ago and cable was brand new. She mentioned something about a cable commission. I asked who they were, and she said they met once a month, although she really didn't know much about it, and I'd have to come back then. Fine. I got the date and location of the next Cable Commission meeting and told her I'd be there. I'm sure I seemed totally unreasonable. She mentioned a couple of times that this wasn't Westmont. I said I knew that, and it's hard to explain, but I knew I was in the right place. She was a little confused, but by this time, manners were the least of my concerns. A couple of weeks later, I found the room where the Cable Commission was meeting and entered. I was surprised to see the rather large room, sort of a courtroom, was empty, except for 3 men sitting somewhat elevated above where an audience would have been if anyone had been there. It was clear the man sitting in the middle was in charge. I don't remember his name, but he must have been, I don't know, late 50s or so. And to his left was another guy whose name I also don't recall, and he was about the same age. On the chairman's right was a young guy, almost a kid. I took extra notice of him because he seemed almost out of place sitting with the 2 old guys. He was easily 20 years younger than me, and the other guys, the older guys, they were older than I was. In any event, the chair called the meeting to order and went through the usual Robert's Rules of Meeting, the minutes and old business, new business, etc. As I watched them going through the motions, I couldn't help but notice that the young guy was the sharpest of the bunch. Despite his young age, he had an instinctive grasp of the proceedings and their obligations. I maneuvered myself to get a better look at the nameplate in front of him. Barrett Peterson. Barrett. Kind of an odd name, I thought. At least I hadn't heard it before. Anyway, they finally got to the part where the public got to speak. It was sort of ridiculous because my wife and I were the only ones there. No matter. I was loaded for bear and started blasting. I had prepared a lengthy written statement. That's right, I still have it. Chris Schutz was a meticulous record keeper, and more than 20 years after her passing, I still marvel at how well organized she was when I have to look up some old material. I miss her dearly, and not just because she was a great secretary, but I am reminded of how valuable her contribution was when I have to find something from the early days. Anyway, yes, I have it, as I thought I would, but I didn't remember it was 16 pages long. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to read the whole thing because a good portion of it is the history of the broadcast industry. Hopefully you'll recall I've already covered that material in this explanation of Motorsports Unlimited. Regarding this material, briefly, this material was presented by me to the Franklin Park Cable Commission January 8th, 1987. I explained the history of the broadcast industry and detailed the development of broadcast following World War I. I did this so the Commission would understand how the broadcast industry became a privileged-only medium in the very early days of radio. I explained the creation of the Radio Act of 1927, followed by the creation of the FCC in 1934 with the Communications Act. In addition, I mentioned related Supreme Court action like Red Lion in 1969. I went through all this because I felt it important to explain why I was standing in front of the Franklin Park Cable Commission asking them to intervene on my behalf in my effort to participate in public access television. I didn't expect them to know all this, as municipal governments are rarely ever involved in free speech and free press issues. More likely they deal with garbage pickup or annoying potholes that need to be filled, or in this case, poor television reception. I was well aware a little background was going to be necessary if they were going to understand my complaint. I detailed how I became aware of public access television and what I'd learned about how the cable industry was fulfilling their obligation and my difficulties, as I've already outlined for this audience, participating in public access television as it was being presented by Continental Cablevision. I also spent a little time detailing television production so they would understand how crippling Continental's roadblocks were. I also went over some of the written correspondence I'd had with Continental trying to erase those roadblocks. As always, I had copies of everything I'd done all the way up to and including my letter to the president of Continental Cablevision in Boston, which surprisingly yielded some results. As I recall, my presentation to the Cable Commission took about 45 minutes. When I finished, I looked at the commissioners to see if I'd made a dent in getting these guys on board and helping me with this struggle. I really couldn't tell. As I recall, they thanked me for my remarks and went about the business of finishing up their business for the evening, without commenting on my complaint one way or the other. I wasn't surprised. I'd hit them with a lot of information I'm sure they hadn't heard before. It was going to take some time to digest what I'd said. I did tell them I'd be at the next month's Cable Commission meeting. Now, as I said, I have the complete text of my presentation as well as the correspondence involved in this issue, but we've already gone through most of it while I've been explaining the origin and purpose of Motorsports Unlimited, and I'll save the agonizing details for my book. The point of mentioning all this was to point out something that did occur that turned out to be a very important and good thing for a couple of reasons, and I'll get to it. The following month, when I arrived at the Franklin Park Municipal Building along with a half-dozen friends I'd persuaded to come with me, I was making my way across the parking lot when I heard a voice calling me. "Mr. Wildt, Mr. Wildt, can I speak to you for a moment?" I looked around and saw the source of the voice. It was a young guy on the Cable Commission with the unusual name, Barrett Peterson. "Sure," I responded and paused. "Listen, Mr. Wildt, I can't speak for the other guys on the commission, but I wanted to talk to you personally before the meeting. During the last month, I looked into what you were talking about. In fact, I went up to Wisconsin and met with the Nationwide Public Access Cable Television Association and told them what you had to say. They told me everything you said was right, and I think we owe you an apology. I can't speak for the others, but you were right. We are supposed to be watching these guys, the cable company, and we didn't even know what you were talking about. We thought it was something about the Americans with Disabilities Act involving handicapped access." I looked at this young guy, and when I say young, I mean more like a kid. I'd done a little inquiring myself during the past month and learned this young guy on the Cable Commission with the unusual name was a law student. He was still in school. I couldn't have been more impressed. He took it upon himself to find out if this angry resident, I wasn't as nice as I should have been, had anything valid to say. And then, after learning that what I had to say was valid, accurate, and important, he manned up and apologized. I made a mental note at the time that I thought this young guy was going to have a great future. As it turned out, I was right. He later finished law school, passed the bar, became a lawyer, opened his own law practice, became involved in local politics, served as a member of the library board, was elected as a village trustee, and today serves at the elected position of mayor of Franklin Park. In my opinion, we're lucky to have him. Not because of recent activities, but because 30 years ago he showed me something more important for a politician than being smart or clever. They all are. He showed me his heart was in the right place. You see, once he learned what public access cable television was all about, he became a terrific ally in the struggle to keep public access despite serious challenges. In short, he got it. It wasn't about this guy Bill Wildt and his determination to save motorsport. It was about everyone's right to be heard in a meaningful way. Public access cable television isn't about me and my crusade. It's about everyone's right to be heard. When I'm asked to speak on this, I often tell people to think of public access cable television as an insurance policy. You don't have it because you want to use it. In fact, one hopes they never have to use it. But if the government decides to build a road through your house, at least you have a real opportunity to be heard. Barrett understood this wasn't about Bill Wildt. It was about all of us and this small effort to satisfy our Constitution's guarantee of free speech and free press for everyone. I'm pleased to point out, years after my initial meeting at the Franklin Park Cable Commission with Barrett, he began producing and hosting a public access television series he called Illinois Issues in Review. This gave him a first-hand look at the value of public access cable television. I'm happy to report he became a serious and valuable advocate for public access television. You see, it started in Franklin Park for me, but I've had to carry this message to a large number of communities over the years in my efforts to protect public access for future generations. Barrett's presence has always been an asset in this effort. Okay, enough time on this, but I want to say the reason I'm telling this story is to mention how important it is to build a good reputation in life. I'm sure Barrett had no way of knowing 30 years ago how his efforts on behalf of public access television when he was a young law student would be with him his entire life. When I have a chance to speak to young people, particularly young males, I invariably remind them of the importance of building a good reputation. A reputation isn't something one can buy or rent. It's something you build in your life and carry with you forever. Don't screw it up. Here we are 30 years later, and my opinion of Barrett hasn't changed. I still remember he listened to what I had to say, then went about finding out if there was value in what I said, probably on his own dime, and then manned up and apologized for not knowing what the Cable Commission should have known. I haven't forgotten. He was special then, and he's special now. In addition, I like to use this story as an example so young people today can look around and see if any one of their peers has the qualities it takes to be future leaders. You see, you won't always be in your early 20s. Before you know it, you'll be in your 40s, then 50s. Some among you will be in a position or seek positions of leadership. Part of your responsibility as a citizen is to select your leaders. It's really nice to see the quality of people before they are in public office. It's important to know who will go out of their way to learn and who can best represent your interests. Think about it. If it doesn't make sense right now, it will in a few years. I'm glad I knew Barrett before the cloak of public life veils the quality of the man. I know what kind of a man he is. It may seem like I'm getting away from explaining the origin, scope, and purpose of Motorsports Unlimited. The fact is, for the first 5 years or so, the struggle to ensure the survival of public access television became a parallel crusade with the fight to save motorsport. You see, for several years before public access cable came along, I'd been unsuccessfully struggling to get the issue of motorsports omission from television on the table for public discussion. I'd had several magazine articles published, as well as an op-ed piece published in one of the two major Chicago newspapers. While it's flattering and encouraging to see your thoughts in print, it really has no power. The power to influence is in television, and that's where the battle has to occur. And yet, for more than 50 years, the public had absolutely no ability to present their views on television until public access cable television came along. By the way, I had no illusion that public access cable alone had the ability to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and its activities. Of course not. It's a national problem, and cable access is local. What I hoped was someone with resources might see our work and get behind us. In other words, instead of talking to a small circle of friends, cable access provided a way of enlarging that circle and reaching people we otherwise wouldn't. I guess I saw cable access as a way of priming the pump, so to speak. One thing was sure, in my mind, we just had to find a way to get motorsports included in network television sports news, or we could not survive. I didn't think a presence on public access cable would solve our problem of being outside the mainstream consciousness of America, but I felt it was the key to reaching enough people with our arguments so that we might have access to the resources necessary to challenge network television and the FCC. In fact, becoming aware of cable access was the first glimmer of hope I saw that we had a way to fight. I wasn't about to let public access go or allow the cable industry to wriggle out of their obligation. The fight to save motorsport hinged on meaningful public access, so I had to fight to keep public access as hard as I was fighting to save motorsport. Of course, there was more to the fight than the survival of motorsport. In my mind, we had allowed an entity, television, into our culture that literally controlled our thinking. Television had become a kingmaker. It was clear to me that one could not be elected to significant public office without television time. A new product couldn't be introduced into the marketplace without television time. This is almost immeasurable power, and while my concern was the survival of the community of which I am a part, it is by no means true that motorsport was the only victim of network television. Staying for the moment in the sports entertainment marketplace, horse racing has all but disappeared, reflected in the fact that, like motorsport, one facility after another has closed. It shouldn't surprise anyone. Let me repeat. One cannot be elected to significant political office without television time, nor can a new product introduced into the marketplace hope to succeed without television time. It's an enormous power, and by extension, one cannot succeed in the sports entertainment marketplace without television sports news attention, particularly when your competitors for public attention have a prominent, continuous, many times a day attention. So, yes, I've wandered off a bit from my story about the fight to save motorsports, but I saw public access cable as the only legitimate opportunity to be heard, and this is a reflection of the reality I experienced. Yes, it makes it a little difficult to follow, jumping back and forth from the battle to save motorsport and the battle to save public access TV, but that's what I had to do. If we lost meaningful public access television, all was lost. In a way, it's a shame we had to fight to keep it. It was always my view, and still is, that the public access provision justifies cable television. And in my view, eventually it may be what keeps cable on the air while broadcast television ends up in serious trouble and losing their broadcast license because of their inability to provide the public with access to this important medium. I would have thought public access is something the cable industry would boast of. For whatever their reasons, that didn't happen. At least not that I could see. I'd hoped to see television commercials indicating something like this. Some of it is silly, some of it is thought-provoking, some of it is poorly done, some of it is good, but none of that is important. What is important is it's not commercial television speaking, it's your neighbors. And public access cable is the only place where you'll hear and see what your neighbors are thinking. The only place. It sure seems to me that's something worth bragging about, and I expected it would eventually happen. Who knows? It ain't over. Anyway, I want you to understand why the fight to save motorsport became an integral part of the fight to assure the existence of public access cable television. In my view, it's the only tool we had to fight with, and as I've already pointed out, there were some good things that happened along the way, like becoming acquainted with the young future leader with the odd first name, Barrett Peterson. Oh, I should say Barrett wasn't the only bright spot. I think I mentioned for several years I spent a fair amount of time giving testimony in various towns and cities. I particularly remember Chicago Alderman Bernie Stone. He really surprised me. He was easily in his 80s when I met with him in his office to discuss public access cable television. When I walked in and saw him for the first time, I remember thinking, this isn't going to go anywhere. This guy is too old to realize the power of television and the cultural problems it creates when only a privileged few have access. Well, my initial thoughts couldn't have been more wrong. He was surprisingly bright and very much understood the value of public access cable. I remember thinking when I left his office that I wish I'd known him 40 years ago. He must have been something. In addition to Alderman Stone, I was impressed with Congressman Danny Davis. The edit suite I used in Chicago for years was right next to the hotline studio where Congressman Davis had a live public access cable call-in show for years. He may still be doing it. I haven't been there in some years. I've been laid up, remember? In any event, I got to know him a little bit as I saw him semi-weekly for years. He didn't need me to know the importance of public access. He knew. I did, however, use the connection to invite him to come to the Rock Thanksgiving morning, which he did. He not only came, he was quite interested in the Rock and this piece of American history. I liked him. There were others, of course. The point is, fighting the public access fight wasn't all bad, although it was certainly time-consuming. There were some pluses along the way, as I've just mentioned. Well, sorry about going off on that tangent, but it's important. For the first time in my life, I was born in 1943, public access cable was the first and only opportunity I or anybody else had to communicate on television. And I wasn't about to let it go, especially when you realize, in my mind, it was the only possible way we had to save motorsport. As I've already explained, our problems all stem from our inability to successfully compete in the sports entertainment marketplace. And that inability was caused by our omission from America's only viable communications medium, television. Now, I'll be the first to admit, cable access television is only barely television. But it is something. Sure, our competitors for public attention have nationwide coverage, while our little public access effort is local, and local television presence isn't going to help us compete with the national juggernaut we face. But it's something. I'm fond of saying public access cable television ain't much, but it's not nothing either. When I first began dabbling with it as a means of fighting the battle we had to fight, I realized how overmatched we were. On the other hand, It was all we had, and I felt it was up to us to try to do something with it. I didn't accept the notion that nobody watches it. I've spent my life competing and figuring out how to gain an advantage even when one had very little to work with. Heck, guys do that at every racetrack in the country on a daily basis. So, here we had a legitimate opportunity to get our community on television, with the caveat that we had to continually fight to keep it. So now that we had something, what were we going to do with it? And how? First, it seemed to me one of the advantages we had was network television, our competitors for audience, was lazy. Why wouldn't they be? For decades, they had no competition. Let's face it, 3 or even 4 channels for a population the size of the United States isn't exactly competition. They really don't know how to fight for audience. I've often said, if these idiots ever had to run a theater on a street filled with theaters, they'd go broke in a few days. I knew they depended totally on a captive audience, and that was clearly an audience we didn't have. In fact, what we were faced with, compared to them, was we were going to occupy an obscure channel, have no chance for advertising resources to let our presence be known. Worse, they were going to do everything better than we could. Better talent, better writing, better television equipment, better lighting, better everything. Pretty dismal outlook, I'm sure you would agree. Yet, it's what we had to work with, and I felt we could do it. First, because they were lazy, they had fallen victim to that laziness. They didn't produce new programming all the time. In a year, they'd produce 13 episodes, or maybe 26. But there are 52 weeks in a year, not 13 or 26. That meant a good portion of the year they were airing reruns, material their audience had already seen. This seemed to me to be a place where we could compete. We could outwork them. I felt if we could produce a new episode every week, perhaps folks would switch to us rather than watching an old I Love Lucy episode. I saw it as a way to be competitive. They were vulnerable. In addition, my plan to include showgirls in our production was something they couldn't do. They wouldn't take the chance. I would. Oh, it's not that there wasn't going to be criticism. I knew there would be, although not nearly as much as I expected, and I was ready for it anyway. I'm not the kind of person who does something without a reason. There is a reason for everything I do, and I'm always willing to explain myself. For those who challenge me for using women as sex objects, expecting me to back away or back down, they soon found I wouldn't. In fact, I've never bought into the notion that there is something wrong with a male's visual attraction to the female. I don't believe it, and I'll go further. It's normal, at least normal for me and everyone I know. And I'll be darned if I'll apologize for normal behavior. The fact is, every woman will at one time or another be the object of some male sexual interest, and it's normal. It's the reason each and every one of us is here. The fact is, nothing but nothing attracts attention like a pretty girl. I wish I had the power. I didn't get it, but I know how to use it. By the way, I'm not the first to discover this phenomena. I'm sure there are many examples in history, but most Americans in this era are aware that when a new television network was started, Fox, they immediately featured beautiful women on their news programs. I found it interesting that they had the courage to do it. You know, short skirts, lots of legs showing, and why not? A pretty girl, or woman if you prefer, is a visual delight. Unfortunately, Fox lacked the courage of their convictions. Yes, it was a good idea to use attractive women to attract an audience. They have a unique power. But they failed to use it fully. In fact, they fell all over themselves to find beautiful women who could flash a little leg, but also had so-called journalist credentials. If I'd been in charge, I'd have contacted every casino in Vegas featuring showgirls and made a deal. Each week, we'd feature a different casino's showgirls in full costume to deliver the news. Please, please don't say anything about credibility. Is there anyone left who really thinks the person on the air actually ferreted out the story, followed up the leads, got confirmation? Come on. Everybody knows the so-called news reporters on television are reading teleprompter copy, and that's the way it has to be. I've been producing television programs for more than 30 years, and I can tell you what the on-the-air talent does isn't easy. They spend their day in makeup and, time permitting, read over their copy until someone points at them and they know they're on. It's the nature of television. And it isn't easy to read a story of which it is unlikely you are familiar and deliver it with the correct enunciation, proper pauses, proper energy, and proper emphasis. If you think it's easy, you've never read from a teleprompter. I've often thought of the Ted Baxter character on the old Mary Tyler Moore Show. I thought the show was particularly well done. Writing, acting, directing, well done and insightful. The Ted Baxter character was the news anchor at a local television station. He was handsome, presented well, had a voice that sounded right. In short, he looked and sounded right. He was also dumb as a box of rocks. It didn't make any difference, though. All he had to do was read the news. He certainly didn't go out and find the stories or investigate wrongdoing. That was the job of others. He read the news. And he did it while sounding and looking right. Of course, as a person, he was often the butt of jokes in the office. I can remember one particular episode where the people who so often made fun of him were forced to fill in for him on the air. Of course, it was a disaster. They found out what he did wasn't easy, and he had a unique talent. I guess I'm telling you this story because I don't want you to think I don't have respect for the on-air people who deliver the news. It isn't easy to do it well, but that sure doesn't make them journalists. I have long been of the opinion that despite the producer's hard work to make television news look like news, it isn't. Nor could it be when they are the only ones who get to talk by law. I'm so often reminded of the criticism so-called news people fire at Russian television when they point out that Russian television news is nothing more than government spokespeople. I can't help but wonder if they really don't know they too are on the air with the permission of the government. I fail to see any real difference. I'm relating these thoughts for a reason, and if I remember, and I will, I'll connect it with a line of thought that is important. For right now, the point is television news isn't news at all. It's pitching, as in pitching a product or pitching an idea. It's not news. Only newspapers deliver real news. The difference? Anyone can print and distribute a newspaper, but only those with the government's permission can be on television. This is one of the reasons I found public access cable television so important. In addition to not needing government permission, for the first time in my life, I had an opportunity to contribute my thoughts to public discourse via television. It shouldn't be unique in a country that guarantees in writing every one of its citizens free speech and free press. But it is. Now, getting back to the idea of using showgirls to read the news. I'm sure it sounds outrageous to you, but I think it's more honest. Let's face it, the objective is to get people to watch. That's why they use people who sound and look right. I've said so many times, I don't care how smart you are or how important what you have to say may be, you can't communicate with anyone if no one is watching. I've so often said, nothing attracts attention like a pretty girl. So, why not have a stunning showgirl in full costume read the news? What difference does it make? No one thinks the television personalities reading the teleprompter are real journalists anyway, and in my mind, having showgirls do it wouldn't be as deceptive. Deceptive? Yes, deceptive. When the television producers select people to read the news, they select people who look and sound right, someone who will meet your expectations of a person who can be trusted and listened to. The only problem is, your expectation was created by them. They created the Ted Baxter image and continue to promulgate the notion what a trustworthy person looks and sounds like. The problem is, because they have silver hair and a firm jawline doesn't necessarily make them someone you should trust. Unfortunately, television conditions you to expect trustworthiness comes from people who look and sound like Ted Baxter et al. It sure explains what happens in our elections. We elect one boob after another because they look and sound right without regard to the important things we should be looking for in our elected leaders. At least if they use showgirls to read the news, we wouldn't be under any illusion that they are there for any other reason than to attract an audience. They wouldn't condition us to be accepting of Ted Baxter lookalikes and what they had to say. The news the showgirls deliver would, of course, have to be first-rate, well-written, well-researched. None of that changes. The only difference would be they would delight the eye while delivering the news. There's another difference, in my mind. They wouldn't condition us with some false visual of what trustworthiness looks like. It would be clear their visual presence wasn't something someone was trying to convince you was the vision of trustworthiness. They were there to entertain as well as read the news. Too bad Fox didn't have the nerve. I suppose I should put your mind at ease. No one is going to employ Bill Wildt to produce news programming, nor would I be interested in doing it. The point I'm trying to make is television producers of news programming leave no stone unturned to convince you that television news is journalism. They do their level best to couch everything in terms that have the sound, feel, and look of legitimate newspapers. And they're not. Not when they are the only ones who get to talk, by law. I actually feel sorry and I'm worried about newspapers. So many have failed and continue to fail in my lifetime. I fear we may be on the precipice of losing all newspapers. Think about it. They're the only ones doing real reporting. They're the ones ferreting out the stories, following up on the details, getting confirmation, only to have television pick up their reporting and repeat it. What happens if newspapers are gone? By the way, I get it. I'm like everyone else. I get my news from television. I don't read newspapers either, but I value them and will kick myself when they're gone, because what will be gone is any real reporting and news gathering. There is a lot at stake here. Our republic depends on an informed population to survive. Informed populations don't emerge from government-controlled news outlets. That's television if you haven't been following. This is a tough problem. Don't misunderstand. I like television. It's an effortless way to consume information, but it brings with it real danger. Think about its power to influence. Major Fortune 500 companies are willing to pay athletes and celebrities big money to just take a swig from their soft drink during an interview. Think about it. The few tenths of a second on television when an athlete takes a drink is worth money. Seconds. Product placement is that important, in part because it conditions you. I guess it's my age. I'm conscious of all this because I've seen it happen. If you'll recall the earlier part of this explanation effort, I explained I'm old enough to easily remember before television. I remember in the late 50s, as television was growing in power, there was concern about what they referred to as subliminal messages on television. They were referring to the process of inserting a frame ever so often to influence the viewers, something like buy pop on the screen. Not long enough to really see it, but long enough to penetrate your subconscious. Experiments have been done with this in movie theaters with alarming results. Subliminal messages work, and in my view, an athlete or celebrity taking a swig of a soft drink is nothing more than advanced subliminal messaging. The point I'm trying to make isn't about whether subliminal messaging works or doesn't. It's to point out the incredible power of television, power that is so great that even a few seconds of it is valuable. Do I have to point out the obvious? Really? If even a few seconds is valuable and affects human behavior, can you see what happens if you are omitted? That is what has happened to the motorsport community. Being omitted from television sports news eventually convinces everyone we are not part of our culture. On the other hand, those who receive overwhelming attention become normal. They must be. We hear about them on television all the time. Not only are they normal, they become special. How many times have you heard on television, the Chicago Cubs are world champions? And you believe it. You heard and perhaps saw it on television. What's wrong with it? Let me count the ways. First, the Cubs don't belong to the city of Chicago or the people of Chicago, regardless of what you might think or what the name implies. Second, world champions? Seriously? I suppose if you think the world begins and ends at the west coast and east coast of the United States and the Rio Grande to the south and just inside Canada to the north, if you think that's the world, and television says so, perhaps you also believe the world is flat. Television's power to influence is enormous, and the world championship, of which television insists, is more like a national championship, and even that is a stretch, as so many parts of the country are not included. The truth is, the Cubs are just a private business competing in the sports entertainment marketplace. But television has a greenhouse effect, making everything included seem larger and more important than it really is. And by default, those not included have no value. I guess no one should be surprised when surveys indicate Americans know very little about the size of the world and the importance and value of other countries. Allowing television, with the permission of the government, to spread such misinformation may seem easily dismissible. It isn't. Television has enormous power. If I were the leader of a country's military and given the choice of dropping a nuclear weapon on an opponent or taking over their television network, I'd take their television network. It would give me the power of telling the people only what we wanted them to know. Sure, a nuclear device can incinerate a country, but then what have you won? An ashtray. By taking and controlling the television network, you end up with something of value and a population you can control. As I said, television is powerful, and one thinks about it, one cannot help but ask, who gets to use it and for what purpose? Am I repeating myself? I hope so. I have to find a way to get it into everyone's head. This is the battle we have to win if we are to survive. It's not an overstatement or hyperbole. It's reality. I repeat, I'm not predicting something that's going to happen. I did that 30 years ago. It already happened. In my lifetime, I've watched us lose O'Hare Stadium, Waukegan Speedway, Meadowdale Raceway, Soldier Field as a motorsport facility, Lake Geneva Raceway, Oswego Drag Strip, US 30 Drag Strip, Raceway Park, Santa Fe Speedway, Ileana Motor Speedway, all gone. Of course, you wouldn't know that because America's communications medium, television, chose not to inform you or anyone else. And why should they? Motorsport wasn't part of our culture. These places were never mentioned on television sports news when they were in operation. You didn't know when they opened. You didn't know anything about the activities going on there. You didn't know about the fierce battles fought at Raceway Park over track championships. You know, Pronger versus Kemperman versus Bud Kaler, or Davey Weltmeyer versus Pat Eklund. Nor did they inform you about O'Hare Stadium's big late model star Freddie Lorenzen moving up to NASCAR, where he dominated, winning nearly every major NASCAR event, including the Daytona 500, one of Chicagoland's very own, making it big. It didn't make the television sports news. I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised when all these places closed without so much as a mention. Things that weren't talked about on television literally didn't exist. And I suppose this reality answers the old question. If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? It doesn't. These facilities all closed as they operated, completely unnoticed, yet during their operation, they carved out pieces of history, all unnoticed. The stars they created, the rivalries they fostered, the thousands of people who participated, and the many thousands who attended the events, all went unnoticed. Except for a few of us gearheads who were thrilled when Don Garlitz, the swamp rat out of Florida, came to town to race Chicago's own Chris the Golden Greek Karmazinis. What? You don't know Chris the Golden Greek Karmazinis? What a shame. One of America's best top-fuel dragster competitors, wrestling 10,000 horsepower nitro-burning supercharged monsters since the 50s. And you didn't know him. Huh. I don't know what to say about that, except it makes me so sad. One of Chicago's own competing successfully against the best our nation has to offer, and doing it in style, the Golden Greek. And he's been doing it for more than 70 years. I saw him race at Oswego, Illinois in the 60s. I saw him race at the Grove in Union Grove, Wisconsin in the 90s. In 1960, he became the first guy in drag racing to make a 200-mile-an-hour pass. 204.54 to be exact, and yes, I still remember. It was at Alton, Illinois in 1960. I was still in Lane Tech High School. It was a big deal to us gearheads when the magazines informed us about what Karmazinis had done. 200 miles an hour, something most experts said could never be done, but the Greek did it. Oh, by the way, he's in his mid-80s now and still racing, except it's now at 300 miles an hour. Don't you think you should have heard of him? You've heard of Walter Payton. You've heard of Michael Jordan. You've heard of Ernie Banks. Don't you think you should have heard of Chris the Golden Greek Karmazinis? Sure, he was born in Detroit, but he's lived most of his life in Chicago. His entire professional racing career, he's been in Chicago. He is surely one of Chicago's own. The reason you don't know him is motorsport and all those who have achieved in that discipline have been omitted from television sports news. Now, you might think my feelings are those of a jilted lover, like I'm offended because I'm part of something that has been rejected. And I'm sure there is some of that. It does hurt my feelings. But this is about business. We live in a capitalist system. Notoriety is worth money. Television has made celebrities of Ernie Banks, Walter Payton, and Michael Jordan. These guys, when their athletic careers were over, could pick up 10 grand by sitting down and signing autographs for a couple of hours. They collected checks for having their names listed as sitting on the board of directors of companies sprucing up their correspondence. They don't get to capitalize on their careers because they hit a baseball well, or threw a ball through a hoop, or ran over opposing players. They can do this only because of their celebrity. Television provided that celebrity, and nothing else in our society can do it. Motorsport achievers have no such capability. When racers stop going fast, they just stop and figure out how to get by on what they may have saved. There is no celebrity in things not granted television spotlight. Are my feelings hurt? You bet they are. But I react differently to hurt feelings. Yes, it hurts my feelings that a guy like the Greek doesn't get the celebrity to which he's entitled, the celebrity along with the rewards that accompany that celebrity. But as soon as the feelings of sadness dissipate in me, it's replaced with anger. Not rage, that's unproductive, but anger that motivates me to fix this problem. I don't want this to happen to the next generation of the technically gifted, those who seek technical solutions to vexing problems, those who ought to be rewarded for their contributions, those who are responsible for the creation of the auto industry. It is hard for me to believe, even though I knew it was going to happen, every track in the Chicago area is gone. You see, that's the problem when society fails to reward those who made them wealthy. They lose that element of society. It's difficult for me to see where we get the people who will lead the technical charge to solve the next generation's transportation needs when all of the facilities fostering the talents of those people are gone. When I was a teenager in Chicago, one couldn't go more than a few blocks before seeing a stock car on a trailer at a gas station. It was that common. Today, 2017, as this is being taped, one never sees that anymore. Why should you see it? All the tracks are gone. And all gone for the same reason. They failed to generate enough revenue to fund themselves and flourish. It's hard to believe this has happened in Chicago, the birthplace of American motorsport and the birthplace of the industry that made our country wealthy, the auto industry. How soon we forget. Speaking of forgetting, I've almost completely forgotten about John Platania, the man who helps me tape these pieces every Wednesday night. John is sick and tired of all this talking stuff and wants more action footage. I'm sure he speaks for many, but these things are important and the issues are important, so I have to take the time to detail them. John is a lot younger than me, and at 74 years of age, I may not have a lot of time left to slowly get this out a little at a time. Of course, it could easily be argued, Bill, if you haven't convinced people after 30 years, perhaps it can't be done. Or perhaps you might not be the person who can do it. Good points all. And as someone comes along to pick up the gauntlet, I'll be glad to sit back and relax. Until then, my position is the same as it was when I started this more than 30 years ago. If not me, who? If not now, when? You know, one of the things that makes making the argument I'm making, the dangers of television, so difficult is the innocent and even compelling look of television. I'm reminded of motorcycling in the early days, my early days, the 50s. I got my first motorcycle in 1957. Motorcycles at the time were noisy, dirty, unreliable, in short, everything that appeals to an aggressive young male. Those who bought and rode motorcycles were a breed apart. Instead of being turned off by the noise and danger, we were attracted to it. A quote in one of the pieces I wrote pretty much sums it up. Many years ago, working on your motorcycle was part and parcel of the motorcycling experience. Very few people who weren't mechanical ever got into motorcycles. Except for the very expensive and somewhat low-tech BMW, they all leaked oil profusely and literally vibrated themselves to death. Back then, we really didn't care. It was part of the manly pursuit of motorcycling. Few people could stand the constant maintenance and serious shaking that riding required. We were tough and we knew it. Others would look at bikers and whisper quietly about how crazy we must be. never said aloud lest we be offended and rain terror upon them. We reveled in that reputation, and it pleased us to be considered among the wild bunch. Not exactly thoughts of which to be proud, as are so many thoughts of young males. There is a point to be revealed in this thinking, or I wouldn't mention it. Motorcycles in the 50s only appealed to a small part of the population. The very nature of them kept nice, normal, middle-class people from participating. They appeared to be menacing, and regular folks stayed away. Then Honda and the Japanese invasion came along. Honda in particular made a point of civilizing motorcycling, both mechanically and in advertising presentation. All that is fine. Manufacturing and selling reliable, quiet, clean motorcycles that easily started with the push of a button? It was an amazing transformation. And as transformative as the machines were, the transformation of the average rider was equally amazing. Where we once had leather-jacketed hardasses, we now had college students and businessmen, and even a few ladies. Now, I feel compelled to concede the stereotypes I just mentioned were rarely accurate, but for the purposes of this discussion, they will suffice. This is not a sociological study. The point I'm trying to make is, when motorcycles stopped being menacing, normal people were no longer afraid of them, and some even came to know their joy. And there clearly is joy. The problem was, they were still motorcycles, even though they were clean and quiet. Heck, some were even pink. But they were still motorcycles. Falling off of an all-state moped was as damaging as falling off of a big, loud, black, intimidating Harley fire breather. It was equally painful. 40 miles per hour is 40 miles per hour. When you bounce off of the pavement, the fact that you fell off of something pink didn't lessen your injuries. The result was increased government involvement in the manufacture and design of motorcycles. The problem was people who we care about were now getting killed or injured. Not just the ne'er-do-wells. It was acceptable to lose a few lowlifes, but it was not acceptable for it to affect the lifespans of Americans, of middle-class Americans. As long as motorcycles were menacing and attracted very few, the damage really didn't affect many. The Japanese invasion changed everything. Motorcycles were no longer frightening. In fact, they were appealing. I found it interesting that people failed to realize the same danger that originally frightened them away from motorcycles was still there. It was merely wrapped differently. Human beings see appearances as that important. The once dangerous sounding and appearing motorcycles were now civilized and non-threatening. Human beings have a peculiar way of not identifying what is really dangerous. They seem driven by a visceral response based on what appears to be dangerous rather than an intellectual response based on information. And that is the core of the problem I'm trying to address. I'm trying to get people to see the danger of a communications medium that presents compelling images and sounds people enjoy, while at the same time influences every thought they have. It's a tough job. I suppose it's a little like being a mom trying to convince her children that eating candy is harmful against the argument that they like it. Yes, we like television. Me too. But allowing a privileged few to literally dictate what normal is, meaning what is presented on television, is dangerous. We elect leaders based on our perception of what leaders look and sound like. We get that perception from television. Oh, it's not just elected officials, it's everything. I remember when my Chris passed away, I went to the local Jewel to get some food. One of the things on my list was pickles. Never having shopped before, I thought to myself, okay, how hard can that be? I was astonished to find myself confronted by an incredible number of choices: dill pickles, sweet pickles, garlic pickles, pickle slices, pickle spears, and then it got worse. Brands. There must have been 50 different brands. What to pick? I really knew nothing about it. Finally, I saw Clausen. Okay, I've heard of that. So I bought Clausen pickles. But, I wondered, how is it I've heard of them and haven't heard of the others? Television advertising. That's where I'd heard of them. I've often wondered if I would have liked any of the others. Perhaps I would have liked them better. I'll never know. I bought what I'd heard of. Television subtly dictated my purchase. There are more examples, but this isn't about the well-established effectiveness of television advertising, and certainly not about pickles. It's about the influence of this powerful medium. Seeing something on television gives it credibility whether it is deserved or not. It's pretty much the same with everything that gets television time. Time on television establishes legitimacy, and what is presented on television is in the hands of a privileged few. Odd indeed that we allow it to operate almost unfettered, a device in many ways more powerful than nuclear weapons, yet we don't see that power. It doesn't appear menacing. I mean, it's Howdy Doody and Dave Garroway and Lawrence Welk. I told you I was old. Anyway, nuclear weapons are frightening to look at. It's easy to see they're dangerous. Television doesn't look dangerous, but like pink motorcycles, have the power to kill you while you're enjoying yourself. Now, I don't want to detail all the ways we are influenced by television and identify all the victims of its enormous power. This is Motorsports Unlimited, and my concern is the survival of what's left of the motorsport community. I'll let the other victims of television, and there are plenty of them, speak up for themselves, and that includes newspapers. Like motorsport, they too will soon be gone. I've already mentioned how in my lifetime I've watched all of our facilities in the Chicago area disappear. O'Hare Stadium, Waukegan Speedway, Meadowdale Raceway, Soldier Field, Lake Geneva Raceway, Oswego Dragway, US 30 Drag Strip, Raceway Park, Santa Fe Speedway, Ileana Motor Speedway, all gone. One at a time over the years, but gone nonetheless. All gone. I'm sure if it were my area of interest, I could make quite a list of newspapers that in my lifetime ceased to exist. Heck, I had a paper route for the Chicago Daily News back in the 50s. I don't know whatever happened to them, but I sure don't see them around anymore. In a way, it's very much like the racetracks. No real announcement or fanfare. They just aren't around anymore. Perhaps someone seeing this will pick up the fight to save newspapers from the monster gobbling up our culture, television. Oh, for those of you thinking, times have changed, Bill, television is replacing newspapers. You haven't been paying attention. Regardless of how television dresses up its so-called news programs to look like news, it isn't news. Not in the sense that it's an independent news gathering and distributing entity, nor could it ever be. The fact is, the only people who get to broadcast must have the permission of the government. That's not news. When they end the sports segment of their so-called news, and after telling you about the latest adventures of the Cubs, Bears, White Sox, et al., and say, that's it in sports, you should be asking yourself if it truly is. O'Hare Stadium, Waukegan Speedway, Meadowdale Raceway, Soldier Field, Lake Geneva Raceway, Oswego Dragway, US 30 Drag Strip, Raceway Park, Santa Fe Speedway, Ileana Motor Speedway, when they were alive, were never or almost never mentioned. It's no wonder that the Cubs, Bears, and White Sox, et al. Is what you think sports are. According to the March 2014 cross-platform report released by Nielsen Media Rating Company, the average American watches television more than 5 hours every day. Once we get past 65, we watch more than 7 hours a day. This means most Americans spend most of their waking hours, not spent working, watching television. Do you have any doubt about its influence? Think about it. And think about the question I keep asking about the public airwaves. Who gets to use them and for what purpose? We'll pick this up again next time. Once again, I've forgotten poor John Platania. Remember? He thinks we ought to have action footage on Motorsports Unlimited. I need John. I have to include some action footage.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.